Hey everybody, this is writer Wajahat Ali, joining you for a great conversation with Jafreen Uddin, who is the boss of Asian American Writers Workshop. I am outside; those are birds tweeting. I am smoking a shisha. Don't judge me. Ramadan has ended, and so I feel zero guilt. And these are the small luxuries during a pandemic. And we're going to be talking about pretty much the conversations we have in our WhatsApp channels and texts that you guys don't know about the challenges and the glories of publishing and writing as a person of color. I think in this particular moment, and why I think organizations like the Asian American Writers Workshop, fellowships, groups like this, or like this type of new multicultural Avengers that can really help. This is my opinion now. Expand and stretch what it means to be America and help fill in the missing pages that have been there for the past 400 years. And so, Jafreen, thanks for joining me and
Thank
not judging me as I smoke a shisha.
Oh, no, are you kidding? That's aspirational, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
But
you and I
also
have endured 30 months of fasting, and we were just
totally,
talking about like how we're exhausted. We're still exhausted.
I'm still tired. I also love how you just described what we do. Like, you need to be our new hype man on the road with us.
I am, you know what? I always tell people I'm like a really good flavor flav for people. Like that's like one of these like skills that I have. I'm the type of guy you want at a party. So if there's a celebrity or like a writer you love and you're like, I can't talk to that person. One of my strange like superhero powers, I'm like, Chimamanda, let's go talk. And they're like, do you know her? I'm like, no clue. I've never met her. This is
Yeah,
literally what happened at a Pen America gala. And I'm like, Chimamanda. And I went up and she's like, hello, okay. And I think she found my awkwardness endearing and I
sure.
was able to introduce a friend. So I feel like anyone who's listening right now, if you ever need a Flava Flav pre VH1, I'm talking about Public Enemy Flava Flav hype man, I'm your guy.
When I met Chimamanda for the first time, also at a different pen event, she told me she liked my makeup, and I was like, "Oh, now we're best friends. Now we're like
Yeah, like,
so tight
like,
right
can I have your email? She goes, get away from me immediately.
now."
I made her bless my child. I think Ibrahim, my son, was there. I'm like, can you bless him with some Chimamanda magic? And she kind of did. I'm like, good, good, thank you.
Nice.
Uh, but you know that was that was an interesting conversation where it was Chimamanda and Hillary Clinton talking
I remember
about
that.
2 years ago. I think it was in New York. You're probably in the audience there too. And
Yep.
then Penn had a great party afterwards with all these writers. It was just really cool. You're like, huh? There's Salman Rushdie. There's Jennifer Egan. There's Chimamanda. And here's me with my children running around like crazy people. And you saw people of color there, and you're like, that's cool. Like maybe, maybe we're breaking that ceiling. Maybe we're getting there. And now we're in 2021, where apparently, well, here's a question:
Yep.
are we in the moment, Jafreen?
You know, yes and no. I think we are in the sense that there is such a public awareness now about, I mean, people talk about racism and classism and all the isms in a way that, I feel like hasn't been just out in the open as before. So that's a great thing. I think the question is like, is it sustainable?
Mm.
Right? And does it go beyond talking? Right? Are we going to move beyond? I think we all know what the problems are. We've done a pretty good job of like establishing those, but are we going to work as a society to actually change things and fix things and move beyond kind of recognizing what a problem is? Um, but I think we are in a moment. I think, when I think about like the Oscars and Asian Americans winning in so many different categories, when I think about, a new generation of editors that are
Mm.
making their way in a lot of the publishing houses, I feel like as a community, Asian Americans, and we approach the word Asian American as like the most radically inclusive as possible. Um, I just feel like we're killing it. We're doing such a good job in spite of so many challenges and so much racism. And,
Mm.
you know, um, I think we're brilliant. It's part of the reason why I took this job and why I'm so honored to be here. Like, I think our community is so brilliant and so smart and creative, and I'm always interested in making sure the world knows about that.
You know, oftentimes we can talk about the challenges and we should address it, but we don't talk about the joys and the successes, which I think is important. You know, an act of resistance to have joy.
Joy
I
is
think,
subversive, right?
yeah,
Like for you to be able to, I mean, it's why I think about like um the movie Minari, right? Like
right.
this beautiful film about rural Arkansas, and in a kind of any less capable hands, it could have easily turned into this cliche about Southern racism, right? And this like Asian family out there. But it wasn't. It was about their joy and I mean their tragedies also, but them just kind of like living their lives. And like, is there anything more American than that? I'm not so sure there is.
The interesting thing is, you talk about the moment, and we've been through it, and I can remember we're the elders now. I always laughed when a lot of our white allies, friends, colleagues said, "Oh, we voted for Obama. We live in a post-racial society," and I'm like, white rage is going to respond to this. Those demons, two steps forward, one steps back, right? And maybe there is something different this time. Maybe there is with the 4 years of Trump, maybe with the George Floyd protest, maybe with the pandemic, maybe with social media, maybe with more stories coming out. Because you did mention, the fact that if things are different, and you want to see those people, our people of color, in those positions in the publishing houses, not just as tokens, because oftentimes it was tokenism. Like that whole diversity conversation, I remember just hell a year ago, because you and I have probably done enough diversity panels to like for 14 lifetimes. It was just, I could just straight up, like for the listeners, it was just like, that they were trying to check a box. They felt guilt. And you are like, should I do this panel? Well, if I don't do it, it's a lost opportunity. So let me Trojan horse any opportunity I can. What's any proof, if there's proof, that if indeed this is a moment that's going to last, that what we're seeing, and you alluded to it, right? Like the more writers, more people in positions of power, editors, the big five publishing companies. What's any proof that this is not tokenism? This is substantive.
I think, I mean, there's a couple of different things. I think, first of all, when we acknowledge the fact that there's no one South Asian story. There's no one Asian story. I always think about at this point. I don't know if it's an actual fact or an old wives' tale, but I've heard this anecdote that I think it was Netflix that passed on Rami's show. Again,
Mm.
this might be an old wives' tale that has been like made up in our.
I can ask Rami. I will ask Rami.
We should ask him to make
Yeah.
sure. Send him an email, but there was this rumor that Netflix passed on Rami's show because they already had Master of None. They already had a Muslim show.
Oh,
And
that was considered a Muslim show.
that was considered a Muslim show.
That's hilarious.
And it's like, what? It's two completely different. I mean, anybody with, forget about whether you know brown people or not. Like, objectively, there could not be two more different approaches. But because a channel already has like a show helmed by a brown guy, they don't need another one, right? I think when we can move beyond that, then we're moving beyond tokenism, and when we can understand that there's actually a spectrum of experiences. And I think it's not just for the white people, it's also for us. Like,
Right.
I think about the people that criticized Never Have I Ever, Mindy Kaling's show, right?
Right.
Of like, this is not my experience, how
And so I
this
have to
is not
dismiss it. It's not
brown,
mine, so I have to dismiss it.
not mine, so it's wrong. It's not mine, so it's evil. And it's like, we need to move beyond that too as a community. We need to not embrace this kind of scarcity mindset where, like, we shouldn't expect one TV show, one book, one movie to represent our whole community because it's not possible. That doesn't happen, right? And so
Yeah.
when we criticize works because it doesn't explicitly represent us, we're playing into that tokenism game, and we're letting them say that there's only one way to represent a community, and that's just
And,
not true.
and it's so interesting. Master of None had an episode where he talked about this, right? Like if there's two brown folks in a Friends sitcom, it becomes a brown
Right,
series, right?
right,
If there's two black people, it becomes a black series, but there could be like 16 white folks. Uh, I'm glad you touched upon this because I, I've experienced this, and I hope the new generation is better, and I think they will get better. But I have actively rebelled against what I call the Highlander theory, and I'll explain it. Like because you mentioned it, right? Scarcity of resources. There can be only one. They can only have one South Asian. Doesn't matter if it's a Sri Lankan or a Nepali or a Pakistani or Bangladeshi. They don't care. It's the lumping. And if there's one Mindy Kaling, that means there'll never be another Mindy Kaling for the next 10 years. So I have to destroy Jafreen. I don't want to, but I have to behead her and absorb her powers, and there can be only one, and I will be the one, and let us just keep killing each other. It's an amazing, if you think about it, it's like an amazing imperialistic colonial divide and conquer tactic that like we absorb
yeah,
as writers of color. It's like not taught to us, but you just know it.
Yeah.
Like I have to get there before the other brown guy. I have to. And
And,
I have to knock his knees out or her knees out to get there first.
and our harshest critics are our own people. And like part of that
Ruthless.
is like, whatever. That's our parents' generation that
Yeah.
we're used to it, right? Love is conditional. I understand that. However, but our communities are the ones that criticize our work the most. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be held accountable. Obviously, like we want to be held to the highest standards. That's not an issue. But when we get to this point where we're pulling people down because they don't exactly represent what I believe or what I think, we're becoming our own worst enemy. And it's like that's not how we thrive. That's not how we succeed.
No, no, and it's. I've always said, and I've seen this throughout my entire career. Been in this game a while, and I always tell this to fellow writers where I see otherwise really good people, uh, like the jealousy and the pettiness. It just takes over because they realize this is my one shot,
Mhm.
and Wajahat got there first, or
Mhm.
Jafreen got there first, right? I say like what I've seen is that once gatekeepers see success, it usually increases the pie because then they're like, oh, maybe there's an appetite for another Mindy or
Totally.
a Hassan or a Rami
Yep.
or a Steve Yun or a Minari, right? Or on and on and on. But I remember, just uh, we were talking about this briefly when I started off. I was in Fremont, California. It was the recession. I was 2008. I just graduated law school. I was 27, and I'm like, all right. I tried to do a play, it didn't take off, and I guess I'll be a lawyer. Oh, great, recession. So I'm broke ass broke, back at home,
Yep.
literally getting like friggin' subzi and dal from my mother, a grown ass man with his
So good. I
Toyota
mean, that's
Camry.
like really good subsidy and doll. Let's
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah. But and like it was just like with my yellow Ethernet cable, and for me in Fremont, I don't know how you were, but this was me growing up. Anytime I saw any brown representation or brown people doing anything, I used to just take some immense pride, and I used to like be a fanboy and hunt them down. So I'd be like hunt them down in a good way. I'm like,
yeah,
I need this person's email. I need to be like, so I had to like actively. I really mean this. I had to actively work to create a fellowship.
yeah,
Uh, I saw you wrote a play. Have you connected with this person? I saw you on a TV show. And then I remember one time a poet who I won't mention, she's emailed me. She goes, "I'm really surprised you're like actually helping. No one does that, and you connected me with another writer."
yeah,
And I feel like when it comes to, I didn't have workshops. I didn't have an Asian American Writers Workshop. I didn't have a fellowship. I didn't have a group, right? So I had to literally create this. And so you guys are lucky. I think the young bucks, even the older folks, right? That there's something like the Asian American Writers Workshop.
yep.
And so the fact that you have this workshop, how do you see this dynamic playing out with this generation? Like, do you see collaboration? Do you see people saying we're in this together? Has
Yeah.
it helped abate a little bit of the scarcity mindset? Or is it still present because we're still dealing with white supremacy?
For sure. I think so. I mean, we were founded in 1991, and our founders were looking for exactly what you created for yourself, right? And um, I think what we're trying to do a little bit differently, a little bit more expansively, is to broaden out that definition of Asian American,
Okay.
right? In America, Asian American often means one thing, right?
Which is what?
East Asian,
Okay.
right? So, like, what are we doing to create the most radically inclusive tent of Asian American as much as possible? That's the South Asians, that's the Middle East, that's, you know, undocumented folks, queer folks, people of color. Like, we want to bring everybody into this tent and provide those exact resources, provide that fellowship, provide those relationships, provide those networks. It's something that happens organically in our physical space in
Mm.
Manhattan. Obviously, we haven't done anything for a year, but you know, the workshop has changed locations, I think like 3 or 4 times in its history. And we've had people who have been familiar with the workshop for decades, and they don't remember what physical space they were in, but
Mm.
they remember how they felt, and they remember like the relationships that they formed. And so I want to do more of that for as big of a kind of community as possible. And in terms of what the latest generation, I think they're embracing it. They, our younger writers are um so brilliant, so collaborative. I think about collectives like the Paraplus Collective that was just created,
The
which
power what?
Paraplus. It's, I think
Paraplus.
I'm pronouncing that right, where it's this group of writers of color
Mhm.
who, recognizing that there is this lack of mentorship opportunities for emerging writers of color, have just like formed a mentorship community, and they announced their inaugural cohort this year, and that was like people gathering on Twitter. It didn't, it's not a formal thing, but it was a community of writers of color recognizing that there is this need and doing something about it, right? And I think social media and the internet does that for us. It allows you to connect to kind of what you and I did with yellow Ethernet cables and kind of like the old fashioned way
Yeah.
happens on a much larger scale in a lot of ways on the internet and on social media.
I mean, I think it's the key word is like community. It's like we were desperately trying to build and find, honestly, a community.
Mhm.
And Renaissance happens oftentimes when you look at Renaissance. It's usually, I mean, we'll look back with it with romantic eyes, but oftentimes, if you really like look deep, it's just a bunch of friends who
Yep.
happen to live in the same geographic location.
Yep.
And I think social media was critical. I mean, in a way we criticize social media. I do because we should because it's done so much damage. But it's a tool. It's done a lot of good also. Without social media, I probably wouldn't have had my career, right? Because I had to do it myself, literally DIY. And I think that's why when people are somewhat critical, for whatever reason, everyone's critical about everything, is that the work that was done in the past to establish fellowships and workshops and that you said you've been around for 30 years, it it allows writers to then just write. They don't have to do all of that heavy infrastructure investment
Yeah.
on like on the ground that takes so much time. Like they
Totally.
can jump in as writers and help create, right? But you said something which is interesting about expanding, and I remember like I don't know if you had this problem, but like it was always like when I was growing up, like what box should I check? And to be honest, like everyone said Asian, but I'm like in my mind Asian meant, or what America thought Asian meant, was Chinese, Japanese, Korean.
Yeah.
Not
Totally.
not Vietnamese, maybe Cambodian, never Desi. I
Yeah.
just didn't feel like it. There was, not
Totally.
never Middle Eastern. It was Chinese and Japanese and Korean. So I always used to check like the hot dog box, which is other, because I'm like I flirted with Asian, I'll flirt with other. Let me experiment with Pacific Islander. I don't know, but I feel like us.
Wow, you checked other, and then what did you write in like Pakistani, or what did you write in?
So sometimes I used to go like Pakistani American. Sometimes you go South Asian. Right. I'm like other Pakistani American, other South Asian, and that's I think it's like profound in the sense because you're like there's no box,
Yeah.
and in the absence of a box, so many of our parents' generation chased whiteness.
Mhm.
I think for protection,
Yep.
to run away from blackness, for cover, for success, and
Mhm.
I feel like it's pretty powerful. I don't think people realize this, to check that box or to have a box which
Yeah.
actually includes you,
Yeah.
right? That's big. People
It's
think, oh, like, oh, whatever, this is just small talk. But I think that's really big to like, that's like, to really feel like you're part of this thing called America.
totally. Totally. And but I think the other piece of that is like, you mentioned like our parents' generation, or even, kind of the working class immigrant communities, like there was this article in the Times, I think it was, and it talked about the term Asian American. And there's also, you're in a place of privilege if you're
Mm,
thinking about like what box you're checking on a
right.
form, right? Like the guy that's delivering your food and is like making minimum wage, like he doesn't care whether he's Asian American. He's not thinking deeply about like what category he falls in under. And that in itself, to even like be thinking about that and have that kind of inner dialogue, it's you're in a place of privilege if you're doing that. And it's part of the reason we try to be as expansive as possible, because it's like, I think there are obviously moments where the specific community is important, right? There are
Mhm.
nuances in the Muslim community that are specific to the Muslim community. There are nuances in every kind of like regional community, of their own. They have their own culture, traditions, whatever. So there's like beauty in the specificity, but there's also something really powerful about the collective. And I think something that ends up happening is we like, discussions get so flattened on the internet. You can only
Yeah.
have one or the other, right? And I feel like we need to embrace nuance more, and we can have both. Like there's like embrace your Muslimness and be a part of this big tent Asian community. Like both are possible.
Well,
So that's what
it's
I try to
not just even labels and thoughts and ideas that get flattened. People get flattened on the internet
do.
often, right? Which is one of the downfalls. And what one thing I really miss about having a one-on-one physical relationship with someone, even like when we had in school, is because you're forced then to engage with people who might agree with you on 7 or 8 out of 10 things, but then you disagree on 2 or 3 things. You're still friends.
Right.
And we've lost that. Like I think so. We've lost that, and I feel like that's the power of a collective. Also, if you're able to expand and create that big tent, is that this big tent can include this person who you might agree with on religious purposes, but on ethnicity and politics you might not, or vice versa.
Totally.
And but then also, and this was always the challenge growing up, the conversation, is that if we say you go Asian American Writers Workshop, Desi Writers Workshop, Muslim Writers Workshop, are we not self ghettoizing ourselves? So how would you respond to that?
So I always think of I actually just thought of this. In Paterson, New Jersey, which is
Mm,
about like a half hour away from me, huge Muslim community, huge Arab community, recently a huge Bangladeshi community. And the numbers of the Bangladeshis are like significant. I think they have like representation in the local government. There are signs, there's like Bangladesh Street, Bangladesh Boulevard, huge. There are 4 mosques because they're all fighting with each other and they can't form one mosque.
awesome.
So what
Like
do
everywhere else.
so what do they see dads do when they get into a fight at their mosque? They start their own, right? They
Yeah.
don't even try to like figure it out. They just start their own. So there are 4 Bangladeshi Muslim mosques in Paterson, New Jersey, right? And I think about it like depending on how you say that sentence, it's either like a moment of pride or a moment of shame, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like a moment of pride, like that's kick ass that there are 4 Muslim mosques with Bangladeshis. Like that's a testament to the numbers. But it's also like you all couldn't like collectively unite to create like a super mosque. So that's why you're kind of fragmented. So I don't know. I don't think it's like again going back to nuance. I don't think it's all bad or it's all good. It's kind of like that's reality, right? That happens, and as long as like we're understanding of that nuance and we're like hanging out with each other using the mosque analogy, then I think it's fine. But are we all respecting each other? Are we uplifting each other? Are we, if there are 4 mosques, that's fine, but are they celebrating each other's success? Like that's what we need to be thinking about. So it's okay to have your specific community,
Yeah.
but are you are you kind of signing on to that motto of rising tides lift all ships? Right. So
So
if we're doing that, we're fine.
how do you, as the Asian American Writers Workshop, deal with that? Because I mean, just to give another example, then if we want to go with the Muslim example, I can tell you that it's in America, it's inevitable. You have to increase the tent in order to make the American experiment work at
Totally.
large. For any community, the same thing happens. You're seeing it playing out. You're seeing the schisms and challenges playing out with Muslims, for example. And anyone who's listening who's not Muslim, I'm sure whatever your specific identity group is in your community is, it's the same. Where the fear is the center won't hold. The stuff that we fought for, our identity, our politics, our religion, will not be able to withstand this. And if we include everything, it will all fall apart.
Mhm.
And especially within some Muslim circles, they're like, my daughter will have a tramp stamp and she'll be on a pole and she'll take vodka shots, and my son will wear a dress and he'll become like a woman now, and then everything's gone and the mosque will be gone. I'm just giving you the extreme version of like some uncle fears, right? And
Totally.
it's over. And so instead of expanding the tent, what we have to do is we have to just maintain. We
Yeah.
just have to maintain, batten down the hatches, because we've worked too hard and we've worked under massive duress. And they used to make fun of us because of our accents, and then we had Trump, and you guys have no idea,
Yeah.
and you guys are coming in with your progressive vision and expanding and including everything, and it's over. And then on the flip side, to be fair, is then you'll have some who are conservative, both politically or maybe when it comes to tradition, or when it comes to whatever, and they'll be like, Asian American Writers Workshop is not for me. They're also progressive. They don't include me in
Yeah.
that tent.
Wow.
So how do you, especially as we become more and more volatile and divided in this country,
Yeah.
especially in my opinion, as you have now a political party, the Republican Party, which is actively embracing white nationalism, actively embracing assault on our democracy, actively embracing voting right attacks, right? How do you then navigate that as a collective, where some people might be like, yo, you want me to accept this fellow Asian writer who literally is siding with my oppressor?
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. I think um, a big tent is made up of individual stories, histories, and lived experiences, right? And that's something that's really special about what we do at the workshop. Like, we don't write, our communities don't write from the white gaze, right? Of like, we have like Bangladeshis telling very specific Bangladeshi stories, right? We have Koreans, Indians, whatever, name any region, any Muslim, any religion that you want. Um, Everyone has the chance to tell their own specific story, right? So,
Hmm.
like, just because you're in the same tent doesn't mean your stories are the same. And I think embracing the individual stories while still being like collectively in this larger group is super important, right? And that's just because everyone's in the big tent doesn't mean each of their stories are the same. So understanding that is most important. And I think also it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, um, allowing ourselves to have multiple forms of representation,
Right.
allowing us not to like get burdened by the fact that this South Asian film, movie, book, whatever, doesn't actually just tell my story. That's
Right.
okay, right? There needs to be room for all of our individual stories. So it goes back to just like nuance, right? Of like, we can be in the same tent and we can respect each other's stories while still being drastically different. And that means, like, honestly, that means bringing in conservatives. That means bringing in more traditional folks. It's
Yeah.
not, I think outrage on the internet is equal opportunity, and everyone and the internet does this, right? Like, whether you're wearing a wrong pair of sneakers or whether you're bombing a village, the level of outrage on the internet is equal for both of those things, right? And that's what the internet does. It's like everything is so heightened and you're either like all in or all out, and that's not realistic, that's not real life. And B, you're going to end up excluding more people than you actually bring in. So if you want to actually authentically bring people in, you need to understand that everyone's not going to agree with you 100%, and that's okay, because that's like that's true diversity of perspective.
I remember the pushback which exists, and these are the internal conversations that happen in communities. Is like, I've talked to many Muslims. We're like, that's not Rami's experience. Is not my experience.
Right?
Are Muslims like this? And
No.
oh my god! And then, but at the same time, other people are like, he's too religious. I'm secular, and I feel like he can't win sometimes because he's
No.
like, yo, the show's called Rami, and
Uh,
I'm just doing the best that I can. But what's so fascinating is him being honest. That's what I always say, like, just be honest to your story,
totally.
and the universality is found in the specifics, because I've had so many non-Muslims and non-Arabs say, yo, like, I find Rami show to be fascinating.
Yeah.
I had a Jewish friend say that, like, this is fascinating. I don't get everything, but there's so much of it like hits home,
Yeah.
identity and like growing up and like religion and like ethnicity. And I feel like, that's the same critique that Aziz got. They're like, yo, he's completely secular and he's eating pork. What the F?
Yeah.
Of course, Netflix and the white gatekeepers are going to put a secular South Asian who like seems to hate his religion, his people. That's the only way he made it, is by selling out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And the only one who does make it is by selling out. I feel like that's why this is an important moment. I think not just to push back against the white gaze and white gatekeepers, but also I think within all this baggage, how that white gaze and white gatekeepers and the scarcity affects and impacts all of us, that is oftentimes not unpacked.
Totally.
Right.
And it also means embracing mediocrity. And I mean this because of this. Like,
Explain.
I'll explain. Because I think we put this pressure on ourselves as like everything that comes out by a brown writer, brown star, whatever, has to be perfect. If it's
Yeah.
not perfect,
This is our
we're
one shot.
it's
It's
our
our
one
it's,
shot.
it's our
Exactly.
8 Mile
We're
moment.
like, and we find things wrong with it. We criticize it. We get so upset if it's not like the perfect representation. I think about the reality show Bling Empire
Yeah.
on Netflix. Like,
It's okay if you watch it. I don't judge you.
oh, I
Yeah,
own it. I
I can,
celebrate the fact that I watch it.
I can sense it from the passion.
I mean, it's so good. But the beauty of it, and I think what actually makes it so much more successful than people realize, it's a mediocre reality show,
Mm.
right? And like that's what we need more of. When there are like white people don't worry about every representation of white people on screen being accurate because they have multiplicity. They have any number of TV shows, whatever to choose from, books, TV shows, whatever. Um, they're not looking for themselves in each and every performance because they have that advantage of multiple representations. We need to embrace that. Like we need to understand that like every representation of brown people on screen doesn't have to be us, and that's okay because there's a diversity of it. And then it's like a bell curve. Some are going to be super accurate and some are going to be mediocre reality shows. When we get to that point, I feel like that's like successful.
I think something that also, which is lacking across our communities, Asian communities in particular, is that many, not all of these narratives and stories, especially with stand-up comedians, it's male-centered.
Mhm.
I know you got Mindy Kaling, and I know you have the show, which I haven't seen yet, Never Say Never. So it's getting better. But how? I mean, you could disagree with me, but I feel like it's like women, especially South Asian women in particular, often don't get that lift,
Yeah.
especially from our communities. And so, do you see a shift there where Asian American women in particular, their narratives and their lives, and just them as commentators, as cultural creators, are being uplifted?
Yeah, I mean, not yet. I mean, we're getting there. I
Mm.
think it's like a slow and steady race, right? But that's probably sexism more broadly, right? Like, it might not just be sexism in our community; it's probably sexism across the board, right? I bet white women might say the same thing about representations of themselves on screen. I don't think it's like um, specific to our community necessarily. Um, but I also think there's also it's so much more complicated, especially if you think of like Muslim women, right? Like making sure that whatever you're putting on screen, Muslim women don't need to be saved, right? But like that's what's always shown on screen.
Yeah.
So it's not just representation there, but it's also beyond the white gaze. It's also like the Muslim gaze. Like we don't, we're not all oppressed and sewing in a corner, right? We have our own individual stories, histories, lived experiences that I haven't seen really anything on screen yet. I don't think we're quite there. I think we are there in terms of writing. I think there are number of really incredible Asian, South Asian Muslim writers, and women are killing it in the literary
Yeah,
game.
crushing it.
Yeah,
Like, if you just
um,
see the books that are coming out right now, it's just like,
totally. I don't
yeah.
think that has translated on screen quite yet.
Yeah, and also it's like a double-edged sword because you get fetishized um, with this Orientalist trope that we've also been accustomed to, Asian women in particular, right? Like they exist as sexual fetishes for white men,
Totally.
and then internally from our communities, I mean, for the most part, I think we could say this confidently, is women end up being the avatars of purity and perfection, and they have to be.
Yep.
And so if you see a woman like you, a woman can't. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if a Muslim you can have a show of a South Asian Muslim woman who talks about sex. Forget Muslim, South Asian woman who talks about sex like Rami does,
Yeah.
or making out or having premarital sex.
And
Like
you
it
know
would
who's
it
gonna
would
judge?
blow people's minds.
Who's going to judge her the hardest? Her own community.
That's what
Like,
I'm saying.
yeah, like the burdens that we place on our people are like amplified times 10 for the women. They're either, you know, not religious enough or they're too religious. Like, you can't win. And again, it goes back to just this inability to embrace nuance. And I say that word a lot and I mean
Yeah.
it just because I think it's so easy to call somebody evil or call somebody a sinner or do this. Like, that's the easy way out. I think it's harder to embrace complexity and embrace nuance and understand that any representation, even if it's not of yourself, is a success if it's coming from an authentic place. If it's telling somebody's lived experience and story, if that's being played out on screen, it's a success, even if it doesn't mean anything for you personally.
Also, in addition to nuance, I think it's just truth.
Hmm.
Like people want to live in fiction.
Yeah.
And so like we're fine living with a fiction and creating a fictional reality of Asians and South Asians and Muslims that doesn't exist,
Yep.
because what will people say? And you have to protect your honor and dignity. And so we're fine living in a fiction, promoting a fiction, repeating a fiction. But if you put truth up there, especially through women
Yep.
and women's sexuality, I
Hmm.
feel like then it's all like it goes back to our old conversation. It will
Yep.
all fall apart.
Yep. Why are
Uh,
you airing our dirty laundry? Why are
yeah,
you
yeah,
putting that out there? Why are you
Center
like
won't hold.
making us look so bad? Totally.
And so it's one of those things where I feel like it's still one of those things that we are behind in our communities, and men, myself included, have to do more. I
Yeah.
feel like not just to promote and invest and uplift in writers who are doing fantastic work, but
Yeah.
also in particular some of those narratives that challenge, especially
Hmm.
women. I think
Hmm.
hijabi, like I'm not advocating this, but like maybe there's a really religious hijabi like Bangladeshi girl who also likes to smoke weed, like, but like loves her Friday prayers.
There is. There
You know what I'm saying?
100% is. We just need to find her, and she needs to be willing to tell her story.
She's like, astaghfirullah, I smoke weed, I need it, but I also love Friday prayers and I wear hijab, but I don't want to give up weed or hijab. Like that would be hilarious to me.
Movie, I'm sure you remember this movie. ABCD, American Born
Yeah, yeah,
Confused.
yeah. Back in the day,
Back in the day, right?
20 years ago.
Kalpen, before Kalpen was
Yeah,
famous.
yeah, yeah.
It was like this like low budget, like filmed, I think, in like Middlesex County College in New Jersey.
That's
Like,
right.
but the Muslim character in that movie, Farah, I think is one of the most like nuanced and progressive representations of Muslim women that I don't think has been replicated since that like low budget or like kind of landmark movie. Um, she was like at the club, she was hanging out, and she was obviously judged by the Muslim guy in that movie. But then she showed up at Friday prayers, right? And she like that tension um was just like embodied so beautifully in that one character, and it was so ahead of its time in being able to like have that character exist. And it's almost a shame because we haven't seen that type of nuance ever really since that movie.
I think you have to give ABCD some props because I remember when it came out, like we all kind of we all saw it, but we all kind of gave it shit too because like it's not a big budget and there's some
Yeah,
throwaway jokes, but at the same time it was really tough. Like he did it DIY, and Cal and Asif Mandvi and all those actors and actresses and Mira Nair and all of them. I'm forgetting a few. I think we often forget what they had to go through just to
totally.
get that out there, and then what people like me then had to go through, and then what Hassan had to go through, now these young bucks. I think that scaffolding approach sometimes it's important because people sometimes don't realize the evolution to get to this conversation,
Yep.
right? And now I feel like an old man. You kids have no idea what it
No,
was
but it
like.
paved the way. I think about that all the time because it's like I remember as like cringy as the movie was, maybe in certain parts, it was also like amazing to see
Yeah.
something like that, produced as a film. Like we didn't have that growing up.
Mhm.
We didn't
We
see
all
people
saw it.
moving
I
like us.
remember. I remember at UC Berkeley, and like all of us guys, we just got the movie and we all saw it together.
Of
It was like
course,
there were like
like
eight
everyone
of us who
gathered
saw it.
together.
Yeah,
Totally.
and I made chai for everyone. I'm like, let's watch ABCD. Like we had to support it. But I feel like and then the comments from this from the cultural creators in our communities is like, yo, our community doesn't like uplift us.
Yeah.
Our parents don't uplift us. There are people who I won't mention who are killing it right now. People you guys know who are listening, mainstream celebrities who literally have told me, man, what I wouldn't give just for my parents to validate like my life.
I know.
These are millionaires. You guys know these people. I won't name them. They're like, if I could just get that uncle and auntie from my community
Yeah.
to validate, and they still don't have it. That's just so. I think just having any community collective to really just tell you, like I tell this to writers often, like especially writers of color, like if you could just find a friend, an elder, just someone, and I say this to elders also, like if you see your kid just have any talent, just to going up to them and being like, "Hey, that was a good story you wrote. You should
Mhm.
keep at it."
Mhm.
That is like fuel, and that's wind that
Well,
will
even
give
like
that person life
or
for
even
years.
I don't understand what you're doing, but I'm proud of you.
There
You
you
know what I mean? Like, you don't have to agree with it. You don't have to understand it. That's fine. You don't have to like it. I'm okay with that. But like, I appreciate the hustle. I am proud of what you're doing. Like,
yeah.
I appreciate the effort. I feel like that goes such a long way. But no, I think you're right. I feel like um when I think about kind of like our community, both in the narrowest and broadest senses, like I don't think we do a good enough job of uplifting each other.
Well,
And it's like we're killing it. We're doing such good work. And I think there's this it's not mutually exclusive from holding people accountable. And I'm
okay.
not saying that you have to agree with everybody. I'm not saying you're not supposed to call people out when they say something wrong or do something wrong. Of course you are. And
Mm,
that's also what you look to your community for. If I say something publicly that is bigoted in any way, inadvertently or intentionally, I want you or whoever else to be able to call me out and be like, hey, that was wrong. And I should be able to like take that into account. You can do that and uplift people. I feel like we put ourselves in this corner where we have to pick one or the other, and calling people out and holding people accountable is very much a part of
yeah,
uplifting them and
yeah.
celebrating their work. And the two can happen at the same time. You don't have to choose.
And oftentimes, as you mentioned before, what happens, especially as we're disconnected from each other, literally during
Mhm.
this pandemic, and we exist mostly on social media, is you get flattened, and it feels like a pylon.
Yep.
And so myself included, like it happens to me all the time. You're just like, wow, man, I just like let me not just engage.
Yep.
Let me disengage and get out of here.
Yep.
And then I'll be like a Ronin. I'll just like do it by myself.
Yep.
And then and even though we're killing it, there are challenges still, right? Because the the world still, I mean, publishing, in the last 6 months, um, yeah, there's big hires. More books are being optioned. Writers of color are getting a bit more money. You're seeing them on the bestsellers list, right? But at the same time, power is still white.
Hmm.
Like we're getting there, but it's still absurdly white. Like I always tell people, especially from Muslim communities, when I give this talk, and I'm like, everyone expects me to say, I've been very lucky in my career that in Hollywood, I had like a failed HBO pilot. I wrote for the New York Times, gone in the Times office, think tanks in DC, philanthropies. Okay. I've met the wizards behind the curtain. And the first thing you might expect me to say is I'm the only Muslim. The first thing to this day, when I go to these meetings and I see the wizards behind the curtain, the first thing to this day I always notice is I'm the darkest thing in this room,
Always. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I always do the counting game.
Hmm.
Black, Asian,
Yep.
me, carpet, plant, right? Like, and then like, and that's what people don't realize is like we're still in an uphill battle. But is there anything that you've seen or that you're doing, uh, especially specifically with this workshop, uh, in trying to use this moment to
Mhm.
Trojan horse ourselves inside this environment?
Yeah. It's so interesting you say that. The Asian American Writers Workshop is the first job I've had where it's been like minority people, right? Every other, I was at the Brennan Center, I was at Penn America. I've always
Right.
been the only brown person in the room, right? That's just like professionally, you just get used to it, right? You've been
I think at Penn you were like literally.
right. I
I
was
remember when
definitely
you
the
were
only.
there.
I think I was the only Muslim too.
Yeah, I
Like,
think so. I think so.
yeah. And so that's been such a part of my career, just like your career, right? We've always been kind of like the only brown, the token brown person in the room. Um, I think what we're doing at the workshop now, and what I feel like is happening more broadly, or I would hope so, is we're coming at it from two different angles. Of there is something inherently valuable about creating a safe space for our community's stories and imaginations. And people say like, oh, you're playing up identity politics or this or that. But it's not even about that. It's about being able to tell your stories to people who understand them. You don't need to translate words. You don't need to say chai tea for them to know what you're talking about. Like,
TT
exactly. You don't need to say
to
non-bread,
bring
whatever.
with bread.
Exactly. Like, you can just like speak your truth, tell your story, and feel understood. I think there is a value in that. But at the same time, and again, it's this ability that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We're also building bridges to these predominantly white spaces,
Mm,
right? I mean, the publishing industry is opaque for anybody. it's a gatekeeping industry. It's about who you know, it's about the connections you have, it's about the money that you have. And that's without the burden of racism, and that's without the burden of systemic challenges for people of color, right? So I take it as like an organizational responsibility for what are we doing to introduce our people and kind of demystify this
Mm.
industry. And we have those connections, we've made those connections with this predominantly white space, right? What are we doing to bridge that gap between this very white industry
Mm.
and this brilliant community of writers that we know exists? And we see ourselves as kind of like, bridge building. The other thing is like, these things take time, quite honestly. The success of our efforts is unlikely to be seen during your and my lifetime.
Mm.
And that's just kind of like the reality of what, of social change, of social change movements. It's slow and steady work. It's not overnight, and it's as much of a generational thing as it is just like time and incremental steps.
Do you, is there anything, and maybe there isn't, but is there anything that you can point to, especially in the past year,
Mm.
where either the Asian American Writer Workshop or like just fellowships or collectives like this have made, like where like the big five, and those who are listening, you guys, the big five is oftentimes referred to as the big five publishing companies, which is Simon Schuster, Macmillan, Random House. What are the two I'm missing? HarperCollins and
PRH, did you say Penguin Random House?
Yeah, Penguin Random House, Harper, Macmillan, Simon and Schuster, and what's the other one? There's one more, I think.
Uh,
But
okay.
that's the big five, right? That like that those are the like the big piece of publishing pie. I think that represents like what 60 to 70%. Uh, and have you been able to? Have they reached out to you? Have you reached out
No,
to them? What's happened?
I will tell you, I'll give you a sneak peek of something we're doing this summer that I
Ooh,
actually want to do
juicy.
more of. We talked a little bit about, we referred to kind of this new editorial vanguard, right? This new kind of crop of editors that's coming up that are being hired in a lot of these. um, I actually just remembered it's not big five anymore, it's big four. That's why we couldn't remember the fourth. Somebody bought somebody. So
Oh,
it's
word.
it's
Wow.
HarperCollins, Simon and Schuster, Hachette, and Penguin Random House, for those of
There
people
you go.
in the know. Um, well, what? But so we're doing this thing, right? We have these like this new generation of editors, and one of them, I'm going to keep his name confidential, who's
Got
at
it.
one of the big houses, emailed me a couple months ago, and he said, "I know your ear is to the ground in terms of like young emerging writers, and the way traditional publishing works is editors only hear about writers through agents, right? Talk
Right.
about levels of gatekeeping, right? Like they're talking to agents, and so if you have an agent, you have a chance of being kind of recognized or seen by an editor."
Got it.
He, as a new kind of executive editor at one of the houses, wants to take the agent out of the process. Like, what am I doing, recognizing my responsibility in this role? What am I doing to meet young new writers and learn about their work and see if any of them can be published? So we have set up a pitch session for our
Nice.
fellows who are going to meet with a team of senior editors at this big four house this summer, and they're going to be given 15 minutes to pitch their work. And
Wow.
it's the kind of thing that like even a year ago
Wow.
would have never happened, right? And that wasn't us doing that. It was a person in this role recognizing the inadequacy of the way the system currently is and actively doing something about it, right?
Mm.
He like, and I think that's, it's not enough to hire people of color. Are you hiring people that are going to do something about it, that are going to like, not, you don't have to upend the system to make real change. You
Right.
have to, but you do have to find new pathways in a system that is traditionally not worked for people of color. And that's what, and that's just one small example of this one editor that, and that's, that's happening. That's what we're doing this summer, and we want to do more of that. And
And
so I'm
that's good allyship, right? For those who are listening, I feel like that's when you use your privilege and positions of power to actually reach out. Because you've probably heard this. I can tell you how many times I've heard this throughout my career, and I know the names of the people. When I say, "How come you don't reach out to X Muslim writers or X South Asians. You can fill in the blank, Asian, Black, Latino, and they go, we just don't know. They don't exist. We have scoured the earth
Yeah, yeah,
and we cannot find one
yeah.
Muslim journalist who is quality. We cannot find one Asian American writer. Where do they get produced?
Yeah.
If you show them, if you bring them to us, and then we always make the Excel sheets and we always give that, and like it was that this was the just the struggle where it was just so humiliating and exhausting
But it's
that
still happening. I mean, after Atlanta, I got put on a spreadsheet because they didn't know who to call for, to talk about like the plight of Asian Americans and violence against the community. And it's like, I mean, sometimes it does feel like you're shouting into the void, right? Like we know that we're here. We know that there are people that can speak to these stories, and um, you know, it, we can shout all we want and we can put ourselves out there all we want, but there needs to be, like you said, allyship needs to go both ways. It's not just about us shouting out there. It's like if you're in a position of power, whether you're white, black, brown, whatever, what are you doing to hear from people that are otherwise never heard from?
well, you just this week that poll came out that said most Americans cannot name more than one prominent Asian American. Isn't that stunning? That's like, and this is a country that was literally built. The railroad
Yeah,
was built by Chinese immigrants, and the
yeah,
reward for their labor was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And as we're sitting here recording this podcast, there's been nearly 4,000 reported hate crimes against Asian Americans since March, when then President Trump decided to rebrand coronavirus as the China virus and Kung flu. And those are only the reported ones. And we all know that hate crimes and hate are underreported, right? And it's fascinating. So you simultaneously see both the victories, right, of Minari, just an example, Parasite, just an example, Asian American lawmakers, and then you also see this. Uh,
but even,
that's
I
that's
mean, remember after 9/11, right? Like what was the percentage of people that had never met a Muslim? I think it was
or
like,
they said they didn't. It was like a
or they
majority
said they didn't
American,
know a Muslim,
they didn't
right?
know a Muslim. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's like, and in addition to that, there was that clear correlation between like your perception of Islam and whether you actually knew a Muslim or
yeah.
not, right? And so, yeah, we're this huge, melting pot or, diverse country or whatever, but like, what are we really doing to get to know our neighbors, our friends, our community beyond like our little insulated bubble?
Yeah, and that's the thing is when, I mean, really, when you actually used to challenge them at that time 20 years ago, you said, I'm a Muslim. They go, oh, no, not you. When we think of Muslim, we thought Osama.
Yeah, yeah,
And that becomes when your people get flattened with one narrative,
yeah.
you get flattened also.
And
Uh,
the other thing is, it doesn't always have to be showy. It doesn't always have to be a big thing. I mean, I think about like growing up. I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey.
mhm. You
Uh,
still rep with pride, I could see.
with pride. Um, Only brown girl,
Mm,
only Muslim girl
mm.
in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I had teachers I remember growing up at every level, from like middle school on, who, when it was Ramadan or when it was Eid, there were those few teachers that were like, what do you think about like just talking to the class about what you're doing? And I understand the criticism of like, I have to like put on this show of being the Muslim person or whatever, but I do think there's value in that, because
Yeah.
like I had classmates there who maybe didn't know that I wasn't eating from sunrise to sunset, or I didn't understand that we don't celebrate Christmas but we have these two other holidays, whatever. And they learned it from like the girl that they did group projects with, right? Not like, it doesn't have to be um this big show of teaching people who your community is. It's in the everyday moments, and it's in like just like talking to people like a normal human being,
You and me had to give the 14 speeches and talks on all things Muslim in South Asia. I was the
That's
same. Like literally like Wajahat, Iraq war, talk about it. I'm like, I'm 10. And they're like, why do Muslim women wear hijab? He goes, I'm a boy. But like I guess like I got up and like said the story.
but not even. And you know what, I wish I could say it stopped in school, but it didn't. It
It still
started.
happens. It still happens.
It still happens, right? You still get pulled in of like, tell us about your people. And don't get me wrong, like it's eye roll inducing. It's annoying that we have to do it, but
In the absence of all the other work, I
100%.
yeah, and I'm kind of like you too. Is like it was one of those things where it's exhausting, but at the same time, I always said that if I didn't do it in that particular community and climate that I was in, in the absence of my narrative, there'd
Yep.
be everything else. And to
Totally.
this day, putting in that investment, I know for a fact has inoculated many of my friends for whom I was the only Muslim in Pakistani. And so when Trump came up, and it's nothing new with Trump, it just got accelerated.
Yep.
They're like, yeah, I don't buy this because I know Waj.
Totally. And I personally, and again, we can have a whole conversation about like the burden of the oppressed and whatever. However, I personally don't feel like I can say no to like telling people about Ramadan, Eid, Muslim, whatever, and then complaining when people don't understand. You know what I mean? Like if I'm given the opportunity to explain and educate, it's on me to take it. I can't say no and refuse and then be mad when they misinterpret, right? Like I'm given that chance. It's a responsibility. It's annoying, but like I feel like the alternative is so much worse, right?
And what I say, yeah, and I agree with you. And what I say now, though, if we're in this moment and if you are serious, what I tell people is that any relationship requires reciprocity, and
Hmm.
any meaningful, healthy relationship requires both sides to come together. So
Yeah,
I'll meet you, but you have to meet me now.
totally.
You can do a Google search.
Yeah.
You can read a book. If you're willing, if you really care and you're sincere, I've put in the effort my entire life. I'm just asking you to take a couple of steps. And if
But
you're
also like we're in May, we're recording this in May, and it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. You shouldn't only think about Asians during May, right? Like think about Asians every month of the year. And it's almost like it doesn't have to be a one-time conversation of, oh, this is the day we're going to talk about people of color. Like let's just normalize it. And I think about that a lot in terms of like Palestine, right?
right,
And you know so much of kind of the misunderstandings and the misconceptions about that conflict are just people being so afraid to talk about it and like call it for what it is, right? And um we need to just say things out loud and be okay with that and call things out. And you know Palestine is occupied, period. And
right.
it shouldn't be this like big dramatic moment to say that out loud. And the more we as Muslims, as brown people, as Asians say these things and are feel empowered to say these things, the more it's out there.
It's a yeah, especially you only talk about it when there's the latest quote unquote conflict
Yep.
in Gaza. But for anyone who knows that reality, it's always conflict. It's always occupied.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I feel like writers. I mean, and I just want your quick thoughts on this. I was talking to a bunch of friends. Is there something different this time with this latest quote unquote conflict or escalation? Because I am seeing many more people, not the usual suspects, not people who are Palestinian or Arab or Muslim, but many more people of color and many more liberal Jews and just many more just white folks
Yeah.
who are openly saying on social media or vis-a-vis their platforms the reality,
Mhm.
which is common sense all around the world, that Palestine's occupied. This is an injustice. This is an oppression. We got to do something about it. Like I did not see this,
No.
and
I
I've been in this for a while, like ever since the MSA days of college. But there seems to be a shift, and
Yeah.
it's not a political shift necessarily, but a cultural shift, which is pretty profound. Am I wrong here?
No, you're not wrong. And I think the shift is actually not even necessarily Palestine specific. I think we're at a point where we're finally understanding that our struggles are connected,
Right.
right? Um, Systemic racism against Black people equals systemic racism against Muslims equals the Palestinian conflict. Like it's all connected, right? And until one of us is like, if none of us are free, all of us are, whatever that phrase is.
Yeah.
We all need to, um, our liberation and freedom, it's intertwined. And I think people are understanding that and making that connection between like George Floyd being murdered and the occupation in Palestine are from the same root of white supremacy,
Yeah,
right?
none of us are free until all of us are free, and I think you're right with the because we're still in the thick of it. And I just threw this out there on Twitter. I'm like, what changed this time? And we've been talking about it. No one's done like a specific analysis yet, but I do think the enduring 4 years of Trump, the 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 trauma of the George Floyd murder, which, George Floyd's happen all the time in this
Yep.
country. The fact that millions of people came out during a pandemic was the largest protest in
Hmm.
American history, anywhere from like 15 to 22 million. The fact that it was global,
Yep.
I think it's one of those things, and social media and narratives and Palestinians speaking for themselves through social media and people seeing it on the ground, bypassing the gatekeepers literally,
Yep.
and then getting alternative narratives to
Yep.
fill in the blanks. There has to be something there where people are saying, huh, this is an injustice, and you don't
Yep.
have to be Palestinian or Israeli or Jewish or Muslim or Arab to care about this.
Yeah.
This actually affects all of us. I think that goes to also the power of storytelling, is what happens when a narrative is missing and
Hmm.
how that shapes perceptions, right?
Yeah.
And so that's when people, like, when people downplay narratives and writing it, uncles and aunties always say that. I'm like, they still see you as a terrorist despite you being here for 40 years and doing everything right, because no one's heard your story. Your
Hmm.
story is either Osama or Saddam,
Totally.
you know?
Yeah.
It's
Or
not,
Apu at the 7-Eleven,
or
right?
Apu, that's it. And
Yeah.
so that's why you need to invest in cultural creators,
Yep.
because culture is where change comes oftentimes.
Totally.
And I'll tell you like a story that a friend told me one time. It was Obama was president. I think it was like 20, I don't know, like one of these White House iftars, maybe 2015, maybe 2014, right? And so he, this was one of the days when it was a smaller iftar, when we actually had iftars,
Yeah.
and it was the latest quote unquote conflict at that time. It was 2014. And he goes like, why isn't the administration doing more? And because Obama knows, Obama knows what's up. Rashid Khalidi, a Palestinian professor, was his professor. He had a Pakistani roommate. He knows what's up. And in fact, I'm here in Virginia, DC. I'm telling you straight up for people listening, most people know what's up. Republicans and Democrats, by the way. And he said, you have to make me do the right thing.
Yep.
And I've heard this from politicians all the time. They said, you have to make us do the right thing. And that usually happens through culture. Like, people forget, like, Democrats were for gay marriage or marriage equality.
Yep.
People forget that. Like,
Obama
no,
wasn't for
yeah,
a
go back to
right.
2008. And
Yeah.
once there was a shift in culture and stories and narratives, and more people came out, and more people knew, and certain lawsuits and education,
Yep.
that created the groundswell, then allowed the political reality to manifest. Right. This is just my spiel for when people say, like, cultures and storytelling and writing and none of this stuff matters. And, oh, how come you didn't become a doctor and you failed us? We didn't come all the way from China or Vietnam or Pakistan and Sri Lanka for you to be an English major, a complet major, or to head up Asian American Writers Workshop. Well,
Yep.
you failed the ancestors. I
Yep.
feel like there's also a component here why we need this investment. Right? Like,
Totally. And I think it's not even obviously um the benefits are paramount for our community, especially that is, not represented and marginalized so often. But I even think about it. I mean, my first job out of college was at the Brennan Center for Justice. It's this like super wonky public policy
yeah,
think tank, but the leadership there and the things that I learned there were always any policy change needed to have success in the court of public opinion first,
right.
right? And you think about like, and it goes exactly back to what you're just saying, like you can't make policy change, social change, whatever, until there's change in the public perception, unless you have like the public on your side. And it's more work, it's harder, and it's annoying that it has to be that way versus like just like easily doing the right thing. But it's also the reality of how we live and the society that we're in.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and I just feel like that's why it's so exciting to see so many writers getting published. So many like there was a huge. I haven't read this book yet. This young Asian American woman, South Asian. I think she wrote this book called Gold Digger,
Mm-hmm.
and this big ass profile came in the New York Times, and like, I had a Chinese American friend who said like, "Yo, you got to get this book." And do you know her? And I'm like, I don't know her. I don't know all of them. I know all fellow Desi writers, but like, let me reach out. And she goes, "This is cool."
Yeah.
And then the white friend said the same thing to me. He goes, "Hey, look at this." And so I feel like that to me, I haven't read the book yet. It's getting good reviews. But I just felt like that to me is like a win
Yeah.
to see that type of book, which is apparently a fun book, but done with through very specific Desi characters. But it's an
Yep.
American story. I haven't read it yet. I'm sure you've read it. You know about it.
It's
Uh,
Sanjana Satyaan. It's
there
called
you go.
Gold Diggers, and I think it just got optioned for a story, a Mindy Kaling show, actually.
Netflix. Sorry, there you go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, absolutely. I think and I also want to say, we're talking a lot about like for our community, putting ourselves out there, doing all this. I don't want to undermine the challenges. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's easy. And I think a lot of times people, you know, when I talk about like the importance of representation or putting yourselves out there, it's like you're undermining the real challenges and burdens that are there.
Mm.
Um, and I think you can do both. And I think that's part of like what makes joy specifically so subversive, right? Of like, um, there's something really powerful in embracing your story and embracing that joy that that also is revolutionary and is powerful enough to deal with these very real challenges, right?
Mm.
I don't mean to like make it a light issue because it's not, but I think we can do both, right?
I hope so. I hope so. I think there's a lot of work to be done,
Yeah,
much work to be done, but at least we're in a better place now than when I started. And thanks to you, and thanks to Asian American Writers Workshop, thanks to Lily, thanks to all the folks who are investing in this. Hopefully, I have kids. I just want to make when they grow up, hopefully it becomes easier. That's the
yep,
main thing. You want to keep pushing it forward. You want to keep expanding and stretching this thing called America, and then
yep,
hopefully we won't have these conversations. We'll have better conversations,
yep,
conversations which are more current, and then maybe we'll see some more Desis as the head of the top four, and it'll be seen just as an American story. Like this is a really good story featuring characters who just happen to be Desi,
yep.
Asian, Muslim.
Cool.
So that's the hope. Maybe we'll get there sooner than I think. I don't know, but I also know this country, and we have to be students of. If you have to be a student of America, you have to be a student of racism and white supremacy. And so we're seeing the demons of white supremacy make their last stand.
Yep.
So it's gonna be an interesting ride. And with that, I am. The hope is I'm trying to do my part. I'm in the final stages of this thing called a book that I'm writing for the first time. I'm going to be receiving my final edits, I think, by the end of this week, and then we're sending galleys out by next month, June, which is when I think this podcast is being released. So it's an interesting time. And so, a lot of the stuff that we kind of spontaneously talked about, like we didn't have notes or anything. In fact, we forgot that we were going to talk today.
Both
So
of
this
us
is kind of,
forgot.
which is why I was casually smoking a shisha, and I'm like, oh snap, this is happening today.
Yeah,
That's what happens. I have an excuse. I have 3 kids.
yeah.
You just don't care. You just don't even look at your Google Calendar. But
Exactly.
it worked out. But like a lot of the stuff that we were talking about that just came out organically is stuff that I tried my best to talk about as honestly and authentically as I could in this book. And so that book is called "Go Back to Where You Came From," and other helpful recommendations on how to become American. That's the entire title, and I'm so glad they kept the entire title. But that'll be out January 2022.
Amazing.
So yeah, so
Yeah,
anyone who's
thank you
listening, let me know what you think.
so much for hanging out with me. This was so fun. I can't wait for your book. I think your book is a perfect example of what we need more of and a lot of what we were talking about today. And yeah, I've just what a treat. Thanks for chatting.
No, thanks for chatting, and I'm gonna drink water now because I can.
During sunlight.
During sunlight. What? What? These are the wins. These are the nerd brown Muslim wins of life. Like I
Thanks
could drink water
everyone.
during sunset. They're like, and then your friends always go, "Oh, I forgot you guys can't even drink water. That's hardcore, bro. That's hardcore. I'm glad you're fasting because I can, but that's awesome." And then they think we're like freaks who are
I
like, our mothers like breast milk like gave us like extra powers that allows us to fast and crush it in spelling bee competitions.
I the spelling bee. I
Yeah.
mean,
With
so
my wife, see, I suck at spelling, which is why my wife was one of those who's also Pakistani. But she's like, and she admitted to me like last week. She goes, "I was in the competitions," and I'm like a little tear of pride came out. Then I'm like, "Did you win?" And she's like, "I got close," and I'm like, "Disappointment,
no, unless you're a
mediocre."
winner. Unless my favorite is when they win and there's confetti everywhere and it's just like ice cold,
Yeah,
like no emotion, no like our kids are so stoic and just like it's like incredible to watch.
but Sarah said that she goes, "They're killers. They're killers." And like they just don't break. And like the only time they break is when they fail, and that's when the tears come out. But, like in victory, they're like, "I could have done it better." And I'm just like, can you imagine? Like we're like, if we just gave our Desi kids like a little bit more confidence, they'll just take over the world.
Or, psychopaths, one or the other.
Yeah, sociopaths or world leaders or
Or
both.
world leaders.
Yeah,
Maybe
because
a little
like
bit of
nothing
both.
phases them.
No,
They're like
nothing.
even as the confetti falls down, they're like, I know.
Like the lack of reaction is my favorite thing in the whole
Yeah,
world.
because it's like a classic Desi staple from our parents. Like, are you proud, father? They're like, not bad.
Okay.
Okay. Like, do you love me? You're okay. And like the little tear comes out, he goes, that means they really love us.
Exactly,
Really love
exactly.
us.
The things, it's a wonder that we made it as far as
Yeah, the fact that we made it's amazing. And
um,
the fact that there's a fire truck is a sign.